When it comes to money, people make choices that seem irrational, wild, even crazy. But here's the twist. No one is actually crazy. Every financial decision, no matter how odd it looks from the outside, makes perfect sense to the person making it. Why? Because their choices are shaped by their own unique story, experiences, and beliefs. In this chapter, we'll explore why understanding that perspective is the first step to understanding the psychology of money, why no one is crazy with money. Unique experiences shape beliefs. Let's start with a simple truth. When it comes to money, no one is crazy. People may act in ways that look reckless, foolish, or irrational from the outside, but to them, in that moment, their choices make perfect sense. Why? Because every decision with money is shaped by the unique lens of personal experience. Think about it. Two people can look at the exact same financial opportunity and see completely different realities. The difference isn't in intelligence. It's in the stories they carry with them. A person who grew up during the Great Depression might see the stock market as a dangerous casino. Meanwhile, someone who only knew the booming 1990s might see the market as a golden escalator that only goes up. Same market, same numbers, but radically different conclusions. This is the heart of the psychology of money. What you've lived through matters more than what you've learned in theory. You can read history books about recessions, but if you've never faced the fear of losing a job or watching your savings vanish, you won't carry the same emotional scars as someone who did. Personal memory outweighs secondhand knowledge. Here's the tricky part. Our personal experiences make up only the tiniest fraction of what's actually happened in the world, yet they shape the majority of our financial worldview. Imagine, your life represents maybe 0.000000001% of economic history, but it could account for 80% of how you believe the economy works. That's why equally smart people can argue endlessly about investing, debt, risk, or retirement. They're each seeing the world through a different, deeply personal filter. Take John F. Kennedy as an example. When he was asked about the Great Depression, he admitted he had no firsthand memory of it at all. His family was among the wealthiest in the world, and their fortune actually grew during the crisis. To him, the Depression was something he only later read about in books. Compare that to families who lost jobs, homes, and dignity during the same period. They carried scars that shaped their decisions for the rest of their lives. Two groups lived through the same era, but their stories were worlds apart. Neither was crazy. They were simply shaped by the circumstances they were born into. The same is true today. An Australian who hasn't seen a major recession in 30 years has no emotional connection to the fear of financial collapse. Meanwhile, an American who lived through the 2008 financial crisis carries an almost instinctive caution about borrowing and investing. Each one believes their outlook is rational, but what seems cautious to one may look paranoid or naive to the other. And here's where empathy becomes essential. We need to stop assuming others are irrational just because their financial choices don't line up with our own. The reality is, they're playing a different game, with different memories, incentives, and risks. The lottery ticket buyer who spends hundreds of dollars every year isn't crazy. To someone with little hope of upward mobility, those tickets are the price of buying a dream. It may not make sense to you, but it makes sense to them. And that's what matters. So when we look at others and think, what on earth are they doing? The better question might be, what story are they carrying? Because behind every money decision is a story about fear, survival, opportunity, or hope. No one's crazy. We're just all telling ourselves different stories. The power of generational experiences. If there's one factor that silently shapes our money decisions more than anything else, it's the time period we grow up in. Economists Ulrike Mamendier and Stefan Nagel studied over 50 years of financial data and discovered something fascinating. People don't just make investment choices based on math or logic. They anchor their decisions to the economic conditions they experienced early in life. Think about that. If you came of age during high inflation, you might avoid bonds for the rest of your life, scarred by how little they seem to protect purchasing power. If your early adulthood coincided with a booming stock market, chances are you developed a deep trust in equities. Meanwhile, someone who saw the market stagnate for years may never believe in its promises, no matter how many charts you show them. These aren't purely rational choices. They're emotional imprints from lived experience. Take Bill Gross, the famed bond manager. He once admitted his entire career trajectory may have been nothing more than the luck of timing. He started investing just as interest rates began a generational collapse, which created a decades-long tailwind for bond prices. To him, bonds were magical wealth generators. But to his father's generation, who endured years of high inflation, bonds were seen as wealth incinerators. Same asset, completely different conclusions, simply because of when you were born. Here's another way to see it. Imagine two people, one born in 1950 and the other in 1970. By the time the 1970-born investor reached their 20s, the S&P 500 had soared nearly tenfold, adjusted for inflation. To them, the stock market looked like a golden escalator to riches. But for the 1950-born investor, those same years brought a market that went nowhere after inflation. Stocks looked like a dead end. Neither investor was crazy. Each was responding to the world they knew. This pattern plays out everywhere. If you grew up in the 1960s America, inflation tripled the cost of living during your formative years. You probably still remember gas lines, shrinking paychecks, and the anxiety of not being able to stretch your income. Compare that to someone born in 1990 who's lived their entire life in an era of low, stable inflation. For them, rising prices barely register as a concern. Again, neither outlook is wrong. They're simply responses to different lived realities. Even unemployment paints this picture. In 2009, the U.S. unemployment rate was about 10%. But that statistic hides the fact that for African-American teenage males without a high school diploma, unemployment was nearly 50%. For college-educated women over 45, it was closer to 4%. Imagine the different stories these groups carry forward about economic security. Imagine how those experiences shape their views on saving, risk-taking, or the need for safety nets. Their financial behavior isn't just about numbers. It's about the world they saw firsthand. History also shows us extremes. Germany and Japan had their stock markets wiped out during World War II, while the U.S. stock market more than doubled in the same period. German citizens endured near starvation, while Americans thrived. How could those groups possibly share the same outlook on investing or risk? Their financial behaviors were sculpted in different worlds. What looks cautious to one may seem reckless to another. What looks optimistic here may seem delusional there. The lesson is powerful. No one should expect people to respond to money the same way. Your experiences shape your instincts, and your instincts shape your decisions. That's why debates about investing, saving, or the future of the economy can get so heated. People aren't really arguing facts. They're defending the logic of their own life story. In the end, the real challenge is not to judge others too harshly. What looks outrageous to you may be perfectly reasonable to someone else who lived through a different set of circumstances. The psychology of money isn't about spreadsheets and formulas. It's about stories. And our stories are as diverse as the generations we come from. Stories behind crazy money choices. Let's look closer at some financial decisions that, at first glance, seem downright irrational. Take the lottery, for example. Every year, Americans spend more money on lottery tickets than on movies, video games, sporting events, music, and books combined. And who buys the most tickets? Statistically, it's the poorest households. The lowest income families spend an average of over $400 a year on the lottery, which ironically is almost the same amount 40% of Americans say they couldn't produce in an emergency. To many, that seems crazy. How can someone living paycheck to paycheck throw away money on impossible odds? But here's where empathy matters. Imagine living in a world where saving seems impossible, where wages are stagnant, and upward mobility feels like a dream you'll never reach. Maybe you'll never afford a vacation, a safe home, or a college education for your kids. Buying a lottery ticket then isn't just about gambling. It's about holding a tiny, tangible chance at hope. For a few minutes, you can picture yourself living the life you see others enjoying. You're not just paying for odds, you're paying for a dream. And when dreams feel scarce, even one in a million chances can feel worth the price. To us, it may look irrational, but to them, it makes perfect sense. Another example comes from a story reported by the New York Times about factory workers in China. Western readers were outraged at the conditions, labeling them sweatshops and demanding reform. But then, a young man wrote in defense of his aunt, who worked in one of those factories. He explained that before she got that job, she'd been a prostitute, exploited daily just to survive. For her, working long hours in tough conditions at the factory wasn't exploitation. It was liberation. It was a better life than what she had before. What Americans saw as inhumane, she experienced as a step up. Again, neither perspective is crazy. They're simply born from different realities. This is the essence of why money choices often look baffling from the outside. Every decision we make with money comes from a story we tell ourselves, a story built from personal history, context, and survival. A parent might choose to avoid investing in stocks because they once saw their family lose everything in a crash. Another might load up on debt because in their community, it's the only path they've seen to home ownership or opportunity. These aren't mathematical choices, they're narrative choices. That's why it's so important to realize. Few people make financial decisions in spreadsheets. They make them at the dinner table. They make them late at night when bills are due. They make them with pride, fear, ego, culture, and survival instincts intertwined. In those moments, what looks like a bad decision to an outsider may feel like the only decision available. And in that moment, it checks the boxes that need to be checked, even if it doesn't stand up to logical analysis later on. Here's the takeaway. When we see others making financial decisions we don't understand, it's worth remembering that those choices are often the result of a lifetime of context we can't see. No one is crazy. They're just solving problems with the tools, memories, and dreams they have available. That perspective changes how we interpret not just other people's actions, but also our own. Why money feels new and mistakes are normal. One of the biggest reasons money decisions seem so messy is simple. We're new at this. Humanity has been using currency for thousands of years, but the modern financial system, the one built on retirement accounts, credit cards, mortgages, stock markets, and student loans, is shockingly young. And because it's young, we're all still learning. Think about retirement. For most of history, people worked until they died. That was just the expectation. The idea that everyone deserves a dignified retirement didn't take hold until the late 20th century. Social Security began in the 1930s, but its early payouts were tiny, nowhere near enough to stop working. It wasn't until the 1980s that retirement as we know it became a cultural norm. The 401k was only born in 1978. The Roth IRA, not until 1998. If that account were a person, it would just be old enough to rent a car today. So when you hear about people struggling to save for retirement, don't think of it as craziness. We're barely 2 generations into this experiment. Or consider college. In 1940, fewer than 1 in 20 Americans had a bachelor's degree. Today, it's 1 in 4. That's a massive cultural shift in less than a century. And tuition? It has skyrocketed more than fourfold, even after adjusting for inflation. It's no wonder families and students have stumbled into massive debt. We simply don't have centuries of experience navigating this. We're still figuring out what higher education should cost, how much debt is reasonable, and whether the payoff is worth it. Mistakes aren't crazy, they're inevitable. The same goes for investing. Index funds, now considered a bedrock of sensible investing, are less than 50 years old. Hedge funds didn't take off until the last 25 years. Consumer credit as we know it, mortgages, car loans, and credit cards, only exploded after World War II. That means most of what shapes your financial life today didn't even exist in your grandparents' time. Imagine being asked to flawlessly master a game that's constantly changing its rules, and you'll understand why so many people struggle with money. It's not madness, it's inexperience. Here's another perspective. We've been domesticating dogs for more than 10,000 years, and they still have wild instincts. By comparison, we've had just a few decades with 401ks, credit cards, and index funds. Of course, we're not perfectly adapted. Of course, we stumble. Of course, we sometimes act in ways that, to an outsider, look irrational. But the truth is, we're all beginners in this system. No one's crazy. We're just new. So what does this mean for us? It means we should approach money decisions, ours and others, with humility. Instead of rushing to judge, we should recognize that we're all experimenting, learning, and adjusting as we go. It also means the best way to grow financially isn't to seek perfect, one-size-fits-all formulas. It's to build awareness of our own story, our own experiences, and how they might be shaping our choices. Once we see that clearly, we can make better, calmer, more compassionate decisions. As we close this chapter, here's the big takeaway. No one is crazy. People make financial choices that fit their story, their circumstances, and their time in history. What looks irrational to you may be perfectly rational to them. Money is not just math, it's emotion, memory, culture, and survival blended into one. And that's why understanding money is less about equations and more about empathy. In the next chapter, we'll add another layer to this story, the powerful roles of luck and risk. Sometimes your financial outcome isn't about your choices at all. It's about being in the right place at the right time, or the wrong one. Let's explore how fortune and misfortune shape wealth in ways that few people ever acknowledge.